Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video we're going to be predicting the patch 3.9 Atlas meta for Conquerors of the Atlas. So if you guys didn't know, in patch 3.9 the Atlas is getting a massive overhaul. Pretty much everything we know is getting tossed aside and making room for brand new content. If you're interested in what's changing, I highly recommend going and checking out my most recent video, as it does a pretty good job of covering everything. But we're not going to be doing that in this video. We're going to be predicting what's going to be the best sector on the Atlas to run, and we have a lot to get through, so let's get into it. To start off with though, there's a few things that have been recently announced which make a massive difference to the Atlas, and that is that single map sustain strategies are gone. So gone are the days of running one map infinitely and kind of never having to buy other maps or run other layouts. We can no longer remove maps from the Atlas, and we can no longer shape maps on the Atlas either. So with those gone, we're going to be shifting our focus from one map to a sector of maps. As you can see here, these are the different sectors. There's a total of 8, and each one of them has a different kind of collection of maps in them. And what we're going to be doing in this video is evaluating those collections and kind of looking at the pros and cons and giving you guys the options that I think will be best for farming in patch 3.9. And we'll be getting straight into that. Before then though, we need to talk about citadels. So throughout Exile Con, they were pretty vague in how we're going to encounter the new endgame bosses, the Conquerors. But recently they released a Q&A and they spoke a little bit about it. So while running maps in the new Atlas, you're going to have a chance for a Conqueror's Citadel to spawn on any of the maps, I'm assuming, in the sector that you're running in. So let's say I run a flooded mine, and then after that flooded mine, I check my Atlas and there's a Conqueror on channel. It'll probably look like a funny icon covering up the map. Upon running that channel, I will then encounter a Conqueror who has a chance to drop a Watchstone or any of the new 3.9 loot, which is pretty exciting. And then upon getting to higher tier maps, for example T14 to 16, I imagine you'll be fighting the equivalent of Guardians on those maps. So that's going to be pretty exciting, and it's going to have a big part to play in the selection of the sector that we want to run the most. In addition to that, obviously we also have to remember that Elder and Shaper and all of their loot drops are now tied to Zana. And Zana will be very important. She is a master within the maps, and you can also accumulate master missions for her by running maps, which you can then selectively choose when to use. So very, very important. So now that we have all out of the way, let's dive in and take a look at these sectors in detail. So as you can see, we have the 8 here, but this isn't a very good way to kind of min-max them, is it? We need more information and we need a spreadsheet, and that's exactly what we have here. So I've gotten all the maps and their names and separated them out into the sectors that we can see here. Immediately, you'll probably notice there's a few colors here. We've got a bit of a color coding system going on, and those are kind of ratings that I've assigned each map based on how good the boss is, the density, the layout, and the divination card that drops in that map. This is just my personal rating system. If you like a specific map, that's fine, but this is kind of just like my min-maxing bow character kind of brain, deciding which maps I like the best. This has been kind of created with a number of players, so it's kind of like a bit of a team effort here to make all of this kind of meta discussion. So, a total of 8 sectors. Which one is the best? And which one are we going to be looking at making the most profit from, or making the most bosses per hour in those citadels? So let's dive straight into it. To begin with though, we need to figure out what kind of like constitutes the best sector. So the best sector should have a few things. The first thing is it should have fast maps. The reason we want fast maps is to obviously generate those master missions so we can get more Zanas, more Nikos, more of all that good stuff faster. So for example, a fast map like City Square is going to be a lot better than a map like Necropolis is when you compare them side by side for kind of currency per hour, master missions per hour, and conquerors per hour. We of course want to run maps as quickly as possible so we can get as many conquerors to spawn out in our Atlas as possible as well. So one point is that the sector with the most powerful and shortest maps will be the best. So for example, one which has a ton of green maps in here, I would kind of like assume that those are more fast maps for most builds, versus one with a lot of red maps in here that might have a lot of slower maps, which are less optimal. So that sector on average might actually be a little bit worse. So pretty interesting there. We also need to consider where the maps with the best divination cards in. Traditionally, maps like lair, alleyways, and stuff like burial chambers have had very high kind of worth divination cards. So running these has an additional kind of reward associated with them. So we want to know where those are as well in case we want to farm them. And the last two here are maps which have good sextant synergy on them. So what I mean by this is, for example, if you have a Harbinger sextant on there, which basically gives you additional currency shards from bosses, you might want a map which has 3 bosses in it. For example, City Square, again, has 3 bosses in it, so you'll get 3 times the amount of value from that sextant off of the boss, which is definitely something you want to be taking advantage of with the new sextant system. So pretty interesting there. And lastly, they've recently announced that in addition to maps leveling up to T14 to 16, unique maps will also level up to T14 and 16. And there's a few of these that this is relevant for. So the Coward's Trial and Poor Joy's Asylum are largely considered one of the best ways to level up a character. Traditionally, these have been set at a very low tier to kind of balance them out, but with them coming up to a much higher tier, they're going to award a lot more experience and they're going to be a lot more powerful. So having a ton of watchstones in one sector with those maps in them is going to allow you to kind of get a lot of currency when they drop, because a T16 or 14 Coward's Trial is going to be worth a lot more than a lower tier one if you didn't have your watchstones in that one. So pretty interesting. In addition to that, we also have Ober's Cursed Trove, which is a pretty interesting one, which levels up way past T16 as you kind of descend into that unique map, as well as Care Blade. Care Blade is an interesting map, and it allows you to kind of accumulate a large influx of high tier maps once you kill the boss. Once you level it up to T14, you're probably looking at getting 5 or 6, maybe even 7 T16 maps off of the boss. So it's going to be very, very powerful to put 4 watchstones in Sector 7 and get that up to a high tier. So with all of those out of the way, let's dive into which ones we actually think are going to be the best. So just so you guys have a bit of a reference for this, Sector 1 is up here, and then we'll travel all the way anti-clockwise around. So this is Sector 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll start back at the start, 5, 6, 7, 8. So pretty easy there, and you guys can kind of pick on the sector that you like. So let's get into the first interesting discovery that we have from setting these out. And that is that the actual amount of maps in each of the sectors is quite different. You can see here that some have more than others, but it's actually quite dramatic when you take a look at it. So these numbers aren't including unique maps, but you can see one of them, like Sector 1, has 13 here, and Sector 7 has 24. So when you're running these sectors and isolating them, like for example, you put 4 watchstones in Sector 7, you're going to have a map pool of 24 T14 to 16 maps versus a map pool of 13 T14 to 16 maps in Sector 1. So you kind of get a much kind of smaller subset of maps that you'll be running in Sector 1 versus Sector 7. So definitely pretty interesting there, and you can kind of pick and choose how many maps you want to kind of run in terms of variety. Now, if you're really observant, you'll notice that that doesn't necessarily matter because there's a lot of really powerful maps in these areas, and it's pretty similar in terms of how many good maps are in each of these sectors. So what we need to do is actually figure out which sector has the most good maps in them. So as you can see here with my rating system, we have S tier, which is pretty insane. It has just everything you'd want from a map or some other special qualities. And A tier is obviously a very good map. You're definitely going to be wanting to chain these. When you look at your stash, you're not like, oh man, I need to run an Infested Valley. You're never like that. You're like, oh yeah, let's get some more of these out of the way. B tier maps are kind of maps that you don't mind running, but they're kind of a bit of a pain. I would describe maps like Marshes, Excavation, and maybe other maps like that to be in this category. Maps that you're not super psyched about, but they're not maps that you just absolutely don't want to run. Yellow maps are kind of like B tier maps. They're maps that some people like running, but they're not maps I would personally run. And these are the maps that I'd start selling, or 3-to-1ing, which is a vendor recipe, which gives you a new map. And then D tier are maps that I would assume are pretty much not ever maps that anyone would run. And these maps are generally going to take either 2 or 3, maybe even 4 times as long as some of the maps which are like listed in purple here, or they just really like have a painful boss associated with them or not much really to offer. And again, guys, remember, clearing more maps faster is going to lead to more bosses to kill, more master missions to do, and just more kind of fun content in the end game. So you want to be doing the faster maps as opposed to the slower maps. So definitely pretty interesting there. So which sector has the best maps in it? That is the next question. So we actually did a bit of math here, and you can see with these percentages, we have S plus A tier maps. We can see as a percentage of the total maps there, how many are in there. So as you can see here in sector 1, only 15% of the maps are A to S tier. Sector 2, 58, sector 3, 47, and etc. So you guys can take a look. I'll link this spreadsheet in the description. But if you're particularly interested in kind of like how many maps that you can expect to get back which are runnable, you really want to be looking at this one here, which is S, A, and B together, because those are kind of like the viable maps that you're happy running, and the ones that you don't really like want to run, those are excluded. So you can see the highest point here is in Sector 4, 80% of the maps are good layouts and ones that you'd consider running, which is pretty important and pretty crazy. The way I look at this is for players who were playing last league, it's kind of like 20% of your maps are kind of like cut and going away. So it's like a 20% map sustain nerf, if you want to look at it that way. So if you look at this Sector 1, it's over 50% less maps, assuming you don't run any of the maps that you don't like the layout of. So you definitely do have to think about it that way. And because of that, I've been able to associate a tier with each of these sectors. As you can see here, I've kind of given them my own personal tier, but you do also have to consider that some people, or maybe yourself, like to run certain maps. So maybe you're a big fan of burial chambers, then you might still do Sector 8. Which is a pretty interesting point to make. So definitely pretty interesting there, but let's go over these sector ranks. So I think Sector 2 and Sector 3 definitely have merit to them, but you'll notice that most of the unique maps are in Sector 5 and 7. So that's why these two specifically haven't got as high rating, even though they have similar kind of B percentages here in terms of their good map drop rate. So that's kind of why they took a bit of a hit, but in addition to that, their maps aren't as good as the ones in Sector 5 and 7, and I will get to that in just a second. But you can see here that they still do have some pretty good maps. Arcade, very good layout, 2 bosses, and it has the Saint's Treasure card, and it also has quite a few other fan favorites in here, but the bosses are a little bit kind of, you know, not as good. Stuff like Waste Pool, stuff like Summit is kind of a bit of a pain sometimes. And that will be pretty interesting to see how that shakes out. Sector 3 has some of the most popular maps in the entire game in it, as Tower, Dark Forest, and Toxic Sewer, 3 massively popular maps, and it has the close to S tier estuary in it as well, which is pretty interesting. So it definitely does have some pretty powerful maps in it, and I definitely couldn't knock anyone for going for this sector. So pretty interesting there. It does have very good stats associated with it as well. Obviously we have Sector 4 here, which is pretty interesting. Has Layer, so a very good map there, but doesn't have those unique maps. And those are really going to be a big kind of like money-making factor, in my opinion, with Coward's Trials potentially being worth, who knows, maybe even half an Exalt, which is pretty interesting. So definitely some big money-making potential here in Sector 5 and 7. Not only that, they also have some very powerful maps, stuff like City Square, Alleyways, Ashenwood Underground Sea. These are all amazing maps with amazing kind of opportunities associated with them, as well as a good portfolio of other maps kind of associated with them as well. So pretty interesting. So the thing which I prioritize when looking for a sector is the following. It has to have at least one map with a really good divination card in it, so that I can take advantage of the Monstrous Treasure Strongbox Sexton. When you roll the Sexton, it says like 500% increased loot from strongbox monsters, you really want to be taking advantage of that with a high drop rate divination card kind of map, or like a valuable divination card map. So something like Ashenwood suits the bill fine. Something like Alleyways, which drops the Saint's Treasure card, is also very good. But you do want to have at least one map in your sector which you can kind of have your go kind of like thing be when you're rolling those sections, because it will pop up and you will want to take advantage of that. Next is you'd like to have a map with 3 bosses in it, and both Sector 5 and 7 have like 3 boss maps in the form of City Square and Crystal Ore. And the reason for this is if you're looking to do some scarab hunting with the Ghost Sextant modifier, you really want to take advantage of that, as it's going to be absolutely crazy in the next patch, with Elder and Shaper scarabs getting buffed immensely. So the average amount of like kind of income from those sextants is going to increase dramatically. So very, very exciting. And the reason you want 3 map bosses is because you can proc the possessed foe, which allows you to kind of automatically complete that sextant and get 10 scarabs almost guaranteed if you roll twinned bosses on that map. So very exciting, and definitely something you want to be looking at when you're assessing your sector. In addition to that, there are also some other sextant modifiers, but those are the main ones that you want to take advantage of, and make sure you have some maps in the sector and saved up for those. So with all of that out of the way, we definitely have some interesting things to consider here, and I would consider Sector 5 and 7 and possibly Sector 4 the best ones to get started with on patch 3.9. They're going to allow you to farm the most kind of like sextant modifiers effectively, and potentially give you the best returns in terms of good layouts, which you can run quickly, effectively, and allow you to get those bosses done as fast as possible. There is a few questions left unanswered though, which may change this a little bit. Firstly, we don't know the exact tier arrangements of these sectors. So for example, let's say we think Sector 7 is amazing, they might make the T16 maps in Sector 7 like Maze, Ivory Temple, and Residence. Well, I think that's unlikely just because of the percentages here of good maps. I think it is possible, and we might have to come back and do a bit of assessment on the T16s later. In addition to that, there is a bit of a wild card here, and that is unique watchstones. We don't know what those do yet, and that is a bit of a surprise we're just going to have to wait for. But with all the information we have now here, hopefully you guys have learned a little bit about these sectors and kind of what to look for when you're selecting which one you want to farm. So when you get to the end game, you can kind of take all those watchstones out, get a really good idea of which red maps you want to farm, socket 4 into your favorite sector, and get to work farming those endgame bosses with the best layouts possible. Hopefully you guys have learned something and enjoyed this video. Expect plenty more on patch 3.9, and I'll see you guys then. Cheers.